Hey, I'm Doug Cohn. I've been building the web since the late 90s. When I first started out on the internet, it was almost exclusively the domain of static sites. In fact, I built things on GeoCities and Zoom. That's Zoom with an X. And I thought it was amazing. And those experiences led to a career that over time primarily focused on Drupal and the WordPress space. Today I get to work at Pantheon, helping customers using web ops to deal with edge cases and edge sites. I'd like to share some of what I've learned about scaling Gatsby, primarily centered around one specific experience, but incorporating some different sites that I've worked on, including my own personal site, with sites that are handling thousands of page views a minute at times. So first, let me set the stage. The main site that I'll be talking about when I share some of the insights that I've learned here is a Drupal 8 site. And this site was migrated from Drupal 7, and it has thousands of content nodes going back decades, covering the organization's very lengthy history. The site receives pretty low levels of traffic most of the year, with huge spikes in a much smaller window around some very specific television live events. Of course, COVID throws a wrench into their plans this year. Normally, the nature of this event is such that the content is revealed in real time during the event. No one inside of the organization, the content editors, etc., knows the content prior to it being revealed there during the event. Now, normally this is not as big a deal because the content team is able to sit in a war room with a live feed from the event right there on site as the event is taking place. And they kind of get the advantage of the 5-minute or however long television delay to give them a little bit of a leg up on getting the content updated on the website. And that's not possible this year because the majority of the event is taking place virtually. So that's kind of the background of the main case in this conversation. And I want to take a little bit of a detour and start by talking about technical debt and why replatforming is rarely the solution for it. If you're considering Gatsby because you think it might take your old busted setup and transform it into something new, I've got news for you. Technical debt is a real problem and something that you need to consider when you're taking older sites to Gatsby or other solutions. It's unlikely that you'll be able to eliminate your technical debt just by adopting a new framework. Core data structure issues might need to be addressed. How the content links together is really important. And if you have limited resources, you'll have to choose which things are a priority as you work through a project. So we'll talk a little bit about some lessons that apply to that. I also highly recommend adopting a more agile approach as you're working through different things. So shout out to this presentation called Kill the Website Relaunch from Pantheon CEO Zach Rosen. And I'd highly recommend that you save that short talk to watch later, as it'll have a lot of value for you. So the problem for this particular site, their old Drupal site, was struggling to deal with the huge spikes of event-related traffic. And so they chose to scale initially by making the server bigger. And that has its limitations. So they looked at moving to Gatsby because Gatsby would give them the insurance that the site would be very difficult to swamp. Static sites are almost impossible to take down with modern website technology. Especially compared to a CMS like Drupal or WordPress. There's no processing. It's simply sending files. So the technology stack is much less complex. Unfortunately, for this particular situation, they shifted their technical debt into the build part of the stack instead of the front end. So users were no longer experiencing server errors, but their content editors were suffering from enormous build times. It's really hard to update a site in a very frequent iterative process when you have to wait 40 minutes for each change to be shipped. And the reality of this replatform was that the CMS issues weren't resolved at all. They were just moved to a different place in the stack. If you have slow queries building a page in Drupal or WordPress, you're going to have slow builds in Gatsby. In fact, that might be the biggest insight that I can give you right now in this talk for existing sites. Without significant consideration to their structure and architecture, it's likely that you'll just shift the problems from any existing technical debt to other locations in the stack. I'm not saying this is wrong, but it's something that you should consider if you're looking at replatforming. So you can see we've built up a couple of issues here. First, there's the long-term CMS with tons of content, and then they have this dichotomy of needing to update content in real time tied to the event that's happening. Of the lessons that I've learned to work with in this particular scenario and constraints, there are 3 in particular that I want to highlight, and also then 3 specific technical solutions that you may be worth considering if you're dealing with similar types of issues. So lesson number 1, we've been kind of already talking about it. Technical debt doesn't disappear when you're adopting an SSG or any other new technology. In fact, the risk is that it could multiply it. Shifting the issues around in your stack might make sense for your project, but don't expect a new technology to be a magic bullet. The biggest question I have for you, if you're already maintaining a CMS, you're keeping your plugins, your modules up to date, you're ensuring that security patches are placed in a timely fashion, well, who's going to maintain your NPM dependencies that you're going to add with Gatsby as you change your site over? So now you have plugins and modules that you have to maintain for the backend, and you've also got to maintain NPM dependencies and ensure that all of that stuff flows. So you could end up multiplying your problems if you're not careful about how you manage the project and considering those types of factors. Another lesson is that we're going back to the agile stuff that I mentioned earlier. The pressure there to get a value out of a year-long project is way higher than something that's much shorter. If you can implement a change to your site on just a segment of your site, for example, if you can use domain masking or something like that to take just the blog section of your site and replatform that in a smaller, less stressful attempt, you'll be able to experiment with it. You'll run into issues early on, and you'll discover things you didn't know and couldn't have foreseen about your site structure and architecture, but with a lot less consequences if you had discovered those 9 months into a 12-month project. The stress level becomes much easier to manage, and it's much more, the value that you can get out of those smaller incremental approaches is much higher. So doing what you can to take your project and bring an agile approach to it instead of relaunching the website every couple of years with all the brand new features is going to be a lot more powerful for your personal stress, as well as you're likely to be more successful with that approach as well. And the last lesson that I kind of took away from this is that nothing beats an immovable deadline in terms of forcing you to compromise and just ship things. Having a live event that you have no control over the timing of, like this particular project, makes it so that you have to choose sometimes between the two choices that you don't like at all, but it forces you to choose and save the perfect for later. And maybe this is just a problem for me. I tend to be a little bit of a perfectionist. So forcing functions that allow me to say, you know what, this is as perfect as I can get, and we just need to ship it, as opposed to, well, but it could be 1% better if you just give me one more month. That tends to be my problem. I don't know if you experience that problem, but it tends to be mine. So there's nothing like having an immovable deadline, something that you can't change, that forces you to choose those compromises and move the project forward. And nothing says you don't come back to those in your backlog later, just that you're going to ship something by a specific date. So jumping into solutions for scaling, the first solution is break the site into multiple builds. In this particular project, there's a very long tail of historical content that's archival quality. It's from the 1950s and the 1960s. It might be interesting to a historian and Google, but most of the main traffic around a specific event is very unlikely to touch that really old content. So having to build that old content every single time is very expensive, And so being able to break the site into multiple chunks is going to be really important for larger sites like this. A big takeaway for this particular use case was that the client chose to use the JSON API out of Drupal. And because of the structure of their site, that makes it really hard to break the site into multiple components and actually get gains on the build time, because you have to spider the entire Drupal JSON API. Whereas if you had used GraphQL queries at the beginning of the architecture, GraphQL has its own issues, of course, but you'd be able to segment your GraphQL queries and have all your dependencies in a single GraphQL query. And so that could be moved into its own build stack a lot easier. Whereas the JSON API, you kind of don't know what you don't know until you build the entire graph using the API and spidering all of the endpoints and their relationships to each other. Another challenge that was faced here was that some of the Drupal endpoints were timing out. And so I ended up forking the Drupal source plugin to add some retry methods and some additional logging in order to determine which endpoints were failing, so that we could track those down and solve those on the CMS site. And I was also able to use e-tags to leverage caching better, so allow that content to be a little bit faster to source at times. Use profiling tools like New Relic to add logging into your builds wherever you can. The more insight that you can have into your stack, the better. And New Relic is one of the best tools available for giving you really deep insight into slow queries on the CMS side of things. With a server-side generator, it's a lot harder to cache things the same way that you might with a CMS serving the content, because the static site generators got to parse all the pages on the site, all the content on the site, one at a time, as opposed to just the most popular content, which is a lot easier to cache. So it's definitely something that you'll find analysis tools like New Relic and any kind of deeper logging that you can add to your site be really important. Finally, we want to leverage our edge caching. So using our partner Fastly, we used edge site includes with this specific project to take particular components of the data and embed them as basically an API call. And so that API call is embedded into the page using the edge site include, and then that's cached at the edge layer. So your local point of presence, wherever that might be in the world, for me it's in Atlanta. My computer goes to that point of presence, and that point of presence has a cached copy of both the embedded content, which can be updated and cleared individually, of the static site content. And so that's something that we were able to leverage for small changes to content. The other thing that you'll find with an edge is, just because your static site is static, it's going to be faster. But there are also other optimizations that you can really do to enhance the performance even better. So having the content super close to the user is obviously one of the biggest advantages of using any kind of CDN. But you can also do things with advanced CDNs like adding HTTP2 support, so that you can shove down more data down the pipe. The user's initial request is for index.html, but you're also sending the page data.json, and you're also sending the static assets, the image files and things like that. You can also use edge functions and some of the different technology at the edge to deal with personalization, A/B testing, and things like that. And so you can really leverage the edge to take your Gatsby site even faster. That's it. So some links. So a little bit about our advanced CDN. The ESI spec, which is available on a number of edge CDN providers, and then also a link to the Gatsby source plugin that I forked if you'd like some ideas on how I went about that. Thanks for listening.